Judge Marilyn Carter was finally on her way home after what felt like one of the longest days she had experienced in months. It had been a day full of back-to-back hearings, a mountain of paperwork, and more than one heated discussion between lawyers in her courtroom. Her voice was a little hoarse from speaking for hours, and her mind was still reviewing the last case she had presided over. The courthouse was now far behind her, and she was looking forward to a quiet evening at home with a hot cup of tea and the sound of the rain that was beginning to tap gently against her windshield. She drove her silver sedan along a familiar route. The streets were still damp from an earlier shower, and the late afternoon sun was dipping behind a layer of clouds, casting the neighborhood in a soft, gray light. She had placed her judge's robe neatly on the passenger seat, the dark fabric, folded carefully. It was a small habit of hers. She never left it at the courthouse, always taking it home to clean and prepare herself. Traffic was light. The hum of the engine and the steady swish of the wipers were almost calming. She turned onto a quieter road, lined with small shops and a few trees with leaves that were just starting to change color. Marilyn had driven this way countless times, and she knew exactly how many minutes it would take to get home from here. Just as she slowed for a stop sign, a sudden flash of red and blue light filled her mirrors. At first, she thought it might be an ambulance or a fire truck approaching, but then she noticed the lights were directly behind her. A police cruiser was tailing her sedan, the lights flashing urgently. Marilyn's stomach tightened slightly, more out of surprise than fear. She glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run any lights or signs. In fact, she couldn't think of a single reason a police officer would need to pull her over. Still, she signaled calmly, easing her car to the side of the road. She came to a stop near the curb. The sound of the cruiser's engine idled behind her. The wipers made another slow pass across the glass, pushing away thin streaks of rainwater. She lowered her window slightly and waited, her hands resting openly on the steering wheel, as she had been taught to do years ago when she first learned how to drive. In the side mirror, she saw a young police officer step out of the cruiser. His posture was firm, and he moved with a certain urgency toward her car. His uniform looked crisp, as though he had only been on duty for a few hours. The officer stopped just short of her window and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "License and registration," he said, his voice short and direct. Marilyn nodded politely. "Of course, officer. May I ask what this is about?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car reported earlier today," he replied, glancing over the sedan as though he were already certain of his suspicion. For a moment, Marilyn simply blinked at him. The words hung in the air, heavier than the drizzle falling outside. "A stolen car," she repeated, keeping her tone calm. "That's correct," the officer said, his gaze moving from her face to the interior of her car. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Marilyn took in a slow breath. She had been on the other side of enough legal cases to know the weight of an accusation like that. She also knew that, in situations like this, emotions could cloud judgment, both hers and the officer's. She kept her voice measured. "Officer, I can assure you this is my vehicle. I have the registration in my bag." The officer's tone didn't soften. "We can sort that out once you step out of the car." Her mind ran through the facts. She had purchased the sedan 3 years ago, paid for it in full, and kept all the necessary documents neatly in her glove box and handbag. There was no way this could be mistaken for a stolen vehicle unless there had been some clerical error. Still, she knew better than to argue. On the roadside, passers-by began to take notice. A few pedestrians slowed as they walked past, glancing between the flashing lights of the police cruiser and Marilyn's car. A delivery driver waiting at a red light craned his neck to see what was happening. The scene was beginning to draw attention, and the weight of their curious eyes only added to the strange pressure of the moment. Marilyn kept her hands visible and moved them slowly toward her handbag. "I'm reaching for my registration," she said in a steady tone. The officer's hand rested near his utility belt as he watched. I said, "Step out first." She paused, then leaned back in her seat. She had handled many situations where facts had been twisted, where assumptions had been made before evidence was even presented. Sitting here, on the side of the road, she was experiencing a very real and personal example of it. The drizzle outside began to thicken, the tiny raindrops making soft tapping sounds on the roof of the car. Her window, partially lowered, let in a faint chill. She noticed the officer glancing again at her sedan, as though searching for any detail that might support his claim. Marilyn studied his face for a brief moment. He looked young, perhaps early 30s, maybe less. His expression wasn't hostile, but there was a sharpness there, the kind that came from someone certain they were in the right. She thought about how quickly situations like this could escalate for other people who didn't have the resources, training, or calmness she had cultivated over years in the legal field. She thought about how many similar stories she had read in case files and how now she was living one. Instead of reacting defensively, she gave a small nod. "Officer," she said softly, "before I step out, I think there's something you should see." Marilyn's voice was calm, but her mind was already moving ahead, thinking about the best way to handle what was quickly turning into an uncomfortable situation. The young officer stood waiting, his posture firm, his eyes still scanning her car as though it were evidence of something he had already decided. She could feel the weight of his assumption pressing in before any facts had been checked. She noticed the way his gaze kept darting to the corners of her sedan, almost as if he expected to see something suspicious pop into view. The slight drizzle had turned into a steadier rain now, blurring the reflections in her side mirror. She could see the flashing lights of his cruiser bouncing faintly off the wet pavement, painting the street in shifting streaks of red and blue. "I need you to step out of the vehicle," he repeated, though his tone was slightly slower this time, as if he were beginning to sense that this was not going to be an ordinary traffic stop. Marilyn kept her hands visible and still. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job," she said evenly, "but I'd like to know, have you run the license plate on this car yet?" There was a small pause. His expression shifted, but not by much. "We'll get to that," he replied, his eyes narrowing just a little. "Right now, I need to confirm you're not in possession of stolen property." Her heart didn't race, but she felt a deep, quiet frustration, not from fear, but from the familiarity of being judged before being heard. She had seen it countless times in her courtroom, a person accused, treated with suspicion, and made to prove their innocence before their side of the story was even considered. And now, she was living it on the side of the road she drove down, almost every evening. Around them, the small audience was growing. The delivery driver who had been stopped at the red light had now pulled into a nearby parking space and appeared to be pretending to check his phone while sneaking glances at the scene. A couple walking under a shared umbrella slowed down as they passed, whispering to each other. Every new pair of eyes made the moment feel heavier. Marilyn thought about what could happen if she simply got out and handed over her papers. It might be over quickly, or it might not. The officer's approach so far told her this could still go in an unpredictable direction. She also knew she had an option that most people in her position wouldn't. She had the ability to show him, beyond any doubt, who she was and why his accusation was not only wrong but serious in its implications. She looked at him steadily. "Officer," she began again, "I respect that you believe you have a match for a stolen car, but I'm telling you plainly, this is my vehicle. I can prove it right now." He glanced toward her bag, as though expecting her to reach for papers. Instead, Marilyn moved her right hand slowly toward the small leather wallet sitting just beside her on the passenger seat. Her fingers brushed the cool surface, and she lifted it carefully. "This," she said, holding it so that he could see the edge of a gold seal inside, "is my identification." The rain drummed a little louder on the roof of her car as she flipped the wallet open. The polished emblem of the state judicial branch caught the light, its intricate design unmistakable to anyone who had ever been near a courthouse. Below it was her name in clear, bold letters, on Marilyn Carter, Judge. The change in his face was immediate. The confident, almost challenging set of his jaw loosened. His eyes widened for just a fraction of a second before his professional mask returned, but the moment had been enough for her to notice. He blinked, as though processing what he had just seen, and then took a small step back. "You're a judge?" he asked, his voice quieter now, though it still carried a hint of disbelief. "Yes," Marilyn replied simply, "and I'm also a resident of this city, which means I'm entitled to the same fairness you should extend to anyone else you stop." For a moment, the sound of the rain filled the silence between them. He shifted his weight, glanced back at his cruiser, then at her car again. The flashing lights seemed louder now, their reflection rippling across the wet road. The pedestrians who had slowed to watch seemed to sense something had shifted in the exchange. The couple with the umbrella kept walking, but turned their heads, once more before disappearing around the corner. The delivery driver finally drove away. Marilyn could see in the officer's eyes that he was replaying his approach in his mind. The way he had spoken to her, the assumption he had made without checking the plate, and the fact that she was now revealing herself to be someone who understood the law better than most. To his credit, he didn't argue or try to pretend he hadn't been wrong. But he didn't apologize either. "I'll need to verify this," he said finally, his voice steady, but lacking the earlier edge. "Of course," she said, handing him her driver's license along with the judicial ID. Her tone remained calm, but inside she could feel the balance of the situation tipping. She had seen plenty of people lose their composure in moments like this. But she had also seen how staying composed could reveal far more than a heated argument ever could. He took the IDs and walked back toward his cruiser, glancing at the seal on the judicial badge again before stepping inside. She watched. Through the rain-smeared windshield as he tapped on the computer inside, the blue glow lighting up his face. It took only a short moment before he stopped typing and stared at the screen. Marilyn knew what he was seeing. Confirmation that the car was registered to her name, that it had never been reported stolen, and that the woman he had stopped was, in fact, a sitting judge in the county's superior court. When he returned to her car, his tone had softened. "Everything checks out," he said, placing her IDs gently back in her hand. She met his eyes for a brief moment. "I'm glad to hear that," she replied. "But I do hope, officer, that in the future you'll consider checking the facts before making such a serious accusation. Not everyone will be in a position to show you credentials like mine." His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to respond, but instead he gave a small nod. The rain was slowing now, and the sound of the wipers seemed louder against the quiet street. Without another word, he returned to his cruiser, turned off the flashing lights, and pulled away. Marilyn sat still for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised, but she knew this wasn't a moment to simply forget. It was a clear example of why awareness, caution, and accountability mattered in every profession, especially law enforcement. She shifted the car into gear and drove on, the soft patter of rain following her home. The robe on the passenger seat seemed heavier now, as if it carried not just the responsibilities of her work, but also the reminder that authority and fairness must go hand in hand. If you'd like, I can now take part 3 and expand it into the same slow-burn, real-life tension style, so the moment she fully reveals her identity becomes even more dramatic and satisfying. That's where the story will really pivot toward the career-ending part. Marilyn could still feel the faint sting of the officer's earlier words as she drove home, but she didn't let it show on her face. Years in the courtroom had taught her that keeping a calm exterior was more powerful than showing frustration. especially in situations where perception mattered as much as truth. The exchange on the roadside was over, but she knew it wasn't the end of the matter. Moments like this carried weight, and their effects often stretched far beyond the first encounter. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. Instead, she had let the truth speak for itself, revealing her identity only when necessary. The officer had seen her judicial ID, recognized its authority, and for a brief moment, his certainty had crumbled. That pause, that instant when his expression changed, was something she would remember clearly. It wasn't about pride, it was about what it meant. In the short silence after she had shown him her ID, the world around them had seemed to slow down. The sound of rain against the windshield, the soft hiss of tires on wet pavement, the muted hum of the police cruiser, all of it had been background to the moment when fact overtook assumption. His eyes had scanned the gold seal, then her name, and then returned to her face with something between surprise and discomfort. For Marilyn, that shift in his demeanor was telling. It was as though he had been walking in a straight line, certain of his direction, and had suddenly discovered the ground beneath him was not what he thought it was. She knew that feeling well. She had seen it in witnesses on the stand when they realized their story didn't hold up under questioning. It was the moment when certainty gave way to doubt. She had no desire to embarrass him, but she also had no intention of letting the matter pass without reflection. As a judge, she had a duty not just to interpret the law, but also to uphold its principles outside the courtroom. The way people in positions of authority acted, whether they were judges, lawyers, or police officers, mattered deeply. One careless assumption could damage trust in the system, and trust was not easily repaired. The officer had returned her documents with a softer tone, but the earlier firmness in his voice had been replaced by something else. Maybe unease, maybe recognition of a mistake. He hadn't offered an apology, and she hadn't asked for one. That was not her purpose. She knew that apologies, while welcome, didn't change the root issue. What mattered was whether lessons were learned and whether actions changed in the future. When she had told him that not everyone could produce the kind of credentials she had, she meant it. She thought about the countless people who had stood in her courtroom over the years, many of them ordinary citizens who had found themselves in difficult situations. They hadn't had titles or special identification to shield them from bias or hasty judgment. Some of them had been treated unfairly long before their cases reached her bench. Marilyn believed that fairness wasn't just something that happened in courtrooms. It was something that had to exist in every interaction where authority was used. The roadside stop had been a small window into how quickly things could go wrong for someone without the same position or resources she held. She imagined, for a moment, how different the outcome could have been if she had not been a judge. If she had been someone driving home from work without a robe folded neatly on the seat, without an ID that could change the tone of the conversation in an instant, would she have been believed as quickly? Would her words have been enough to slow the rush to judgment? The truth was, she didn't think so, and that truth sat heavily in her thoughts. When she had first reached for her ID, she had done it deliberately and slowly. She had watched the officer's eyes, seen the way they flickered toward the seal and then back to her. He had taken in the weight of what he was holding, not just a piece of plastic and metal, but a symbol of a role that demanded respect, a role that dealt daily with questions of justice and fairness. The air between them had felt different after that. His posture had loosened slightly, the edge in his voice softening. The formality remained, but the unspoken authority of his earlier stance had weakened. He had gone from being in full control of the situation to realizing he might have acted too quickly. Marilyn knew moments like this could be turning points for people. Some would reflect, learn, and adjust their approach in the future. Others would grow defensive, dismiss the incident, and continue as they had before. She hoped the officer would fall into the first category. She didn't speak again until he returned her documents. And when she did, she chose her words carefully, not to lecture, but to plant a seed. She told him plainly that not everyone had the same ability to prove themselves in a moment like this. Her point was simple. The burden of proof should not fall unfairly on the person being stopped. The responsibility for accuracy belonged to the person making the accusation. The quiet between them after she spoke carried a weight that words couldn't fill. The rain had begun to ease, and the smell of damp asphalt drifted into the car through the open window. She could see the water beading on the edges of the badge before she tucked it back into her wallet. The officer gave a small nod before returning to his cruiser, and though the encounter ended there, Marilyn knew that the larger story was still ahead. Encounters like this didn't simply fade. They became part of the chain of events that could lead to change, or at least to a deeper awareness of how easily assumptions could cloud judgment. She drove the rest of the way home with the wipers moving more slowly now, the streetlights beginning to glow in the early evening haze. She didn't feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in having to use her position to correct a mistake that should never have been made in the first place. But she did feel certain about one thing. This was not the last time she would think about that moment on the side of the road. It was the kind of incident that stayed with a person, not because of anger, but because of what it revealed, about human behavior, about the way authority was exercised, and about how easily trust could be damaged. And as a judge, Marilyn knew that trust was the foundation on which everything else depended. She had faced difficult cases, challenging courtroom debates, and moments where the right decision wasn't always obvious. But in those moments, she had learned that listening, truly listening, was often the key to finding the truth. She wished the officer had taken a moment to listen before acting, to ask a question before making a decision. For her, the moment when she revealed her ID was not just about showing proof of ownership for her car. It was about shifting the balance of the interaction. It was about bringing the focus back to facts instead of assumptions. And in that small but significant way, it was about justice, not in the courtroom, but on a quiet street in the middle of a rainy afternoon. By the time she reached her driveway, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving behind a sheen on the pavement that reflected the last bits of daylight. She turned off the engine, sat for a moment, and let the quiet settle. The robe beside her was still neatly folded, a silent reminder of the responsibility she carried. She picked it up, draped it carefully over her arm, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The day had been long, and the incident on the road had been unexpected. But Marilyn knew that the way she handled such moments mattered just as much as the way she handled cases in court. In both places, the goal was the same, to ensure that fairness wasn't just a word, but a lived reality for everyone. The next morning, Marilyn arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The sun had not yet fully risen, and a pale light filled the marble-floored lobby. She greeted the security officers at the entrance, her voice as steady as ever, but her mind was already set on something beyond the day's cases. The events from the night before were still fresh in her thoughts, not because she was angry, but because she felt a responsibility to act. She had handled thousands of cases over the years, and she had seen situations where one person's decision, in a single moment, had changed the course of someone else's life. As a judge, she knew that ignoring something wrong, no matter how small it seemed at the time, often meant allowing it to happen again. This was one of those times when silence would solve nothing. After organizing her case files for the morning session, she closed her office door and began writing. Her desk was always kept neat, pens in a single holder, paper stacked evenly, and her nameplate shining in the soft light from the desk lamp. She pulled a blank sheet of official letterhead and began drafting a statement. The letter was clear and precise. It explained exactly what had happened the day before. The stop, the officer's initial claim that her vehicle was stolen, and the fact that he had not run her license plate before approaching her. She described the interaction without exaggeration or emotion, simply laying out the sequence of events as they occurred. Facts, she knew, were the strongest foundation for any case. She also noted the presence of bystanders, the weather conditions, and even the time of day. Every detail mattered. Her years on the bench had taught her that clarity left no room for misunderstanding. At the end of the letter, she requested that the incident be reviewed by the department's internal affairs division. She didn't make demands. She simply asked for a thorough and fair investigation. Once the letter was complete, she signed it, then scanned a copy for her own records. She also made a point to request the police dashcam and body cam footage from the stop. She knew those. Recordings would show exactly what had been said and how it had been said. By mid-morning, the letter was sent to the chief of police and the head of internal affairs. Marilyn did not expect an immediate response. These processes took time, but she knew she had done her part to start the process of accountability. 2 days later, an official envelope arrived at her courthouse office. The seal of the police department was stamped across the front. She opened it to find a formal acknowledgement of her complaint. The letter stated that an investigation would begin immediately and that she would be contacted if additional information was needed. A week later, she received a call from an internal affairs investigator named Thomas Avery. His voice was calm and his tone professional. He explained that he had reviewed the dashcam footage and it confirmed what she had written in her report. "Judge Carter," he said, "the officer did not run your plates before the stop. The video shows him making the accusation about the vehicle being stolen within seconds of approaching your window." Marilyn listened quietly. She had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still carried a certain weight. Avery continued, "This is not the first time we've had concerns about his stop procedures. There have been previous complaints, some about incorrect information, others about incomplete checks before making contact." That information settled heavily in her mind. It meant the incident she experienced wasn't an isolated mistake, but part of a pattern. Patterns were dangerous because they meant behavior was not being corrected, and when behavior went uncorrected, it could lead to more serious problems. Avery explained that the investigation would include interviews, a review of the officer's records, and an evaluation of his adherence to department protocols. Marilyn knew the process would take weeks, maybe months, but she also knew it was the only way to ensure the matter was handled properly. During those weeks, she continued her work in the courtroom. She presided over hearings, issued rulings, and maintained the steady composure she was known for. But in the background, the investigation quietly moved forward. One afternoon, she was called to provide an official statement in person. She arrived at the Internal Affairs Office, a plain building with neutral-colored walls and rows of filing cabinets. The interview room was small, with a table, 3 chairs, and a recorder placed in the center. Avery sat across from her, a legal pad in front of him. Another investigator, a woman named Carla Jenkins, joined them. Together, they asked her to recount the events once again, this time with every possible detail. Marilyn described the officer's tone, his body language, the timing of his statements, and even the expressions she saw on his face. At one point, Carla asked, "When you showed him your judicial ID, how would you describe his reaction?" Marilyn paused before answering. It was as if a door had opened in his mind. He realized instantly that the person he had stopped not only knew the law, but could also hold him accountable if necessary. His confidence faltered in that moment. That's not because of me personally, but because the badge reminded him that facts matter more than assumptions. The investigators wrote down her words carefully. They thanked her for her time and told her they would contact her once the review was complete. Several weeks later, Avery called again. His tone this time was slightly more serious. "Judge Carter, the investigation has concluded. The officer will be facing disciplinary action." Given his history of similar issues, the recommendation is termination. Marilyn listened quietly. She didn't smile or react outwardly. She simply said, "I appreciate the department taking this seriously." She knew some might expect her to feel a sense of victory, but that wasn't what she felt. What she felt was a cautious sense of relief. Relief that the incident had been addressed properly, and relief that perhaps fewer people would experience the same kind of stop she had. That night, she reflected on the process. The dash cam footage had been a silent witness, capturing the exact words and tone that had passed between them. It had shown the truth without bias or interpretation. She thought about how fortunate it was that the technology existed, and how many stories in the past might have ended differently if such clear evidence had been available. The complaint wasn't just about her. It was about the principle that authority must be exercised with care and that mistakes must be acknowledged and corrected. She knew that not every case ended with this level of accountability, but each one that did made a difference. As she sat at her desk that evening, the courthouse now empty and quiet, she looked at the folded robe on the chair beside her. The robe symbolized her role in the justice system, but the events of the past weeks had reminded her that justice wasn't only something that happened inside the courtroom. It was something that had to be defended everywhere, on the street, in daily life, and in the moments when assumptions threatened to replace truth. She turned off her lamp, gathered her things, and stepped out into the cool night air. The sky was clear now, the rain from the previous days gone. She walked to her car, unlocked it, and paused for a moment before getting in. The same car that had been called stolen not long ago now sat quietly under the streetlight, a reminder that the truth had been there all along. It had just needed to be seen. The notice came quietly, not with a loud announcement, but with a short official email from the police department's public information office. It confirmed that the officer involved in Marilyn's traffic stop was no longer employed with the force. The words were brief, almost clinical, but Marilyn understood what they meant. The investigation had run its course, the findings had been reviewed, and a decision had been made. She sat at her desk reading the message twice. There was no mention of her name, and she preferred it that way. This was not about recognition or publicity. For her, the focus had always been on the principle that accountability must exist, no matter who was involved. Still, news had a way of traveling. Within a day, a local journalist called her office requesting a statement. The reporter explained that they were preparing a story about the officer's termination, and while Marilyn was not named in the department's statement, her identity was known within certain legal and civic circles. She listened quietly to the reporter's questions before answering in the same measured way she approached courtroom matters. "I'm not speaking to condemn anyone," she said evenly. "I am speaking to remind people that the law must be applied with care, and that every citizen deserves to be treated with fairness and respect. This was not about me as a judge. It was about me as a person who, for a moment, was on the receiving end of an incorrect assumption." The reporter paused, perhaps expecting a more dramatic soundbite, but Marilyn's words were deliberate and steady. She didn't want this to become a personal clash. She wanted it to be seen for what it was, an example of what could happen when procedures were not followed and assumptions replaced evidence. A week later, the article appeared in the Sunday paper. It described the sequence of events in clear, factual language. It mentioned that the officer had failed to run the vehicle's license plate before making the stop, and that this was not the first time his conduct had been questioned. It also explained that the decision to terminate was based on repeated procedural violations. Marilyn's name was included, but not in the headline. Her quote about fairness was placed near the end of the article, almost like a closing note to the piece. She was relieved to see that the coverage was respectful and avoided sensationalism. In the days that followed, she received a handful of letters and emails from members of the community. Some were from people she knew, others from complete strangers. A retired teacher wrote to say she had once been wrongly accused of shoplifting, and that reading Marilyn's calm account of the traffic stop made her feel less alone. A young law student said the story had inspired him to focus on civil rights law. Marilyn read each message with care. She didn't reply to all of them, but she kept the letters in a small folder in her desk. They reminded her that even one moment, handled with composure, could ripple out further than expected. The police department, for its part, did not release many details beyond the official statement. But she heard through colleagues that there had been discussions within the department about retraining officers on proper stop procedures and the importance of verifying information before making contact with a driver. That, to her, was perhaps the most meaningful outcome. It meant the incident could lead to real changes, not just a single termination. Life in the courthouse moved on. The cases on her docket continued to arrive, each with its own complexities and challenges. But Marilyn found that she approached certain situations with an even greater awareness now. She thought often about how quickly people formed judgments, and how dangerous it could be to act on them without pausing to check the facts. One afternoon, months later, she was leaving the courthouse when she noticed a young woman hesitating at the bottom of the steps. The woman looked nervous, clutching a folder of papers. Marilyn recognized the expression immediately, the look of someone unsure if they would be heard or understood. She stopped and asked gently, "Are you here for a hearing?" The woman nodded. "Yes. I'm worried they won't believe me," she admitted. Marilyn gave her a small, reassuring smile. "The truth has a way of standing on its own," she said. "But it helps when you're calm enough to let it speak clearly." She didn't explain why she knew that, so, well, she simply wished the young woman luck and continued on her way. That evening, as she drove home, she passed the same stretch of road where the flashing lights had first appeared behind her months earlier. The rain was light again, just as it had been that day, and the street was quiet. She glanced briefly at the curb where she had pulled over and felt a strange mix of memory and closure. She realized she didn't feel anger when she thought about the stop anymore. What she felt instead was a kind of quiet satisfaction that she had met the moment without letting it spiral into something worse. She had stood her ground, spoken with calm authority, and followed through on ensuring the matter was addressed properly. In her mind, the real end of the story wasn't the officer's dismissal. It was the conversations that might happen in police training rooms, in living rooms, in classrooms. Conversations about why facts should come before assumptions, and why respect should be the starting point in every interaction. As she pulled into her driveway, she turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the faint patter of rain on the roof. The house was warm and waiting for her inside, but she lingered in the stillness. The robe was on the passenger seat again, neatly folded, a symbol of the responsibility she carried every day. She picked it up, stepped out into the cool air, and closed the door behind her. The porch light glowed softly, guiding her inside. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new decisions, and new challenges, but tonight she allowed herself to rest, knowing that one small but important chapter had been brought to a close, not just for her, but for the principle she had worked to protect.